Hey everybody, this is Dr. Bafana with another lecture on Middle East politics. This is going to be the second from the last lecture in this series. So for those of you who have watched these videos, thanks for listening. So in today's lecture, we're going to talk about a very depressing topic, democratic backsliding. And it's very sad to be talking about this topic right now. So, as someone who's an American citizen myself, I'm currently living in a country, right, that is undergoing this as we speak. And so I think it's really important that we understand what democratic backsliding is and how it takes place, as well as why it takes place. So, of course, America is a great case study, but there are tons of others out there. And if you study Middle East politics, there are a couple of countries that have undergone this process, particularly after the Arab Spring revolutions of 2011, which is our last unit, right? And there are two major case studies within the Arab world that are critical here, Egypt and Tunisia. So in this lecture, we're going to understand why democratic backsliding takes place. Now, of course, in order to understand why it happens, we have to understand what it is. Like, what is democratic backsliding and what are its causes, right? So, what leads a country to fall from grace? So, we're going to do that first. We're going to understand what is democratic backsliding. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature on the topic in the process. Now, on top of this, we're going to understand why efforts at democratization failed after the Arab Spring. Most countries that had these revolutions, their democratization processes never even got off the ground, okay? And in only two did it take place, and only in one did you have consecutive, competitive, and free and fair elections. And in that one case, even there in Tunisia, the democratization effort failed. So we're going to look at these two case studies. We're going to spend most of the time looking at Egypt because we spent a lot of time last class looking at Tunisia. I lived through this in Egypt. It was very sad going through this because there was so much optimism at first, so much hope for the future. And that hope was really dashed out by 2013 when the military stepped back into power there. So first, we're going to have to define this concept. So, what is democratic backsliding? Well, it's when democracies become dictatorships. We've defined these concepts in previous lectures. So, a democracy has free and fair competitive elections to determine who rules the government, who rules the legislative and executive branches, right? So, there are tons of different types of democracies out there, parliamentary and presidential. So, what they all have in common, there's competitive elections that also respect basic civil liberties and political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, the right to due process, right? So you have a right to a free and fair trial. And in dictatorships, there is a lack of competitive elections and these basic civil liberties and political rights. Now, of course, dictatorships do vary. There are many different types of them. There are military dictatorships and single party and monarchies and electoral authoritarian regimes. There are theocracies. We went over all those different types. But what all those dictatorships have in common is there's a lack of genuine competition within the political system for power. Now, how does democratic backsliding take place? So, what are the mechanisms? Well, it can happen in a great variety of ways. Certainly, it could happen via state collapse and civil war. It could happen via what's called a military coup. Now, a coup d'etat is when the military overthrows the states, okay? That's how Egypt's democracy collapsed in 2013. And we talked about coups early in the semester. Now, the other way is something called an autogolpe. And we haven't talked about this semester yet. An autogolpe is when you have a democratically elected figure, usually the sitting executive, the president or the prime minister, that centralizes power. Now, they could do this via a number of ways. They and the legislature that they might control can do this by passing new laws that weaken the country's democracy. They might make it harder for the opposition to compete in elections. They might make it harder for competing media outlets to get established and to express their opposition to the sitting government. They might make it harder for universities to be able to produce independent research. Or perhaps they can strip away the power of the judiciary, okay, to make it harder for judges to have independence and to rule, okay, on cases that they feel are unconstitutional. Now, on top of that, they also might make changes to the Constitution, greater structural changes that reduce the quality of the democracy, that strip away basic civil liberties and political rights, that might make it easier to arrest people and put them in prison. Now, informally, they might also just use uninstitutional violence, right? So going and sending the military or the police to crush a protest, for example. And these different mechanisms enable the president or prime minister to centralize power and to eliminate their enemies. Now, this could happen very quickly in the span of a few weeks or months, or it could happen over many years, sometimes even decades, as a country like a frog boiling in water, slowly increase the temperature, and the frog doesn't even notice, and before they know it, they boil to death. Well, this could happen in a democracy, right? You slowly, introduce these reforms that make the country less democratic, and before you know it, there are no longer competitive, free, and fair elections. Now, why does this take place? So the why of it. So why do citizens tolerate this? Why do they go from a situation where they support democracy to where they support dictatorship? Well, it often happens because the democratic system starts to lose its legitimacy with the public. People feel like the democratic system no longer represents them, it's no longer performing, or they feel like they can no longer compromise with the political opposition. And in this sort of situation, what emerges is support for what is called populist rhetoric. Now, populism, it's a rhetorical strategy used by those who do not support the current sitting democracy, by outsider politicians who start to criticize the current democratic system. And the type of rhetoric these new class of politicians promote is a mix of anti-establishment and anti-system rhetoric. Now, anti-establishment rhetoric is when you denounce the current sitting parties in a democracy. So if you're in the United States, that means a politician who is denouncing the Democratic and or Republican parties. Or if you are in, for example, Great Britain, you're denouncing the Conservative and Labour parties. So whoever those sitting parties are, you're basically claiming they are no longer legitimate. Now, maybe you're claiming they're legitimate because you're saying they represent, these wealthy oligarchs or, these corrupt elites. Or maybe you're saying they're no longer legitimate because they're doing things that are bad for the public. Maybe you don't like the fact that they are pro-migration or the fact that they are pro-capitalism. Whatever the reason, you come out with some reason that delegitimizes the sitting government. Now, anti-system rhetoric is geared towards not just the political parties, it's geared towards the entire democratic system itself. And you start to promote alternatives. Those alternatives might be theocracy, they might be fascism and a single party dictatorship. Whatever the alternative it is, you're promoting it at the expense of the democratic system. And so the way populist rhetoric works, you're promoting this idea that there is this corrupt elite controlling the democratic system, and they are suppressing the good people. And those good people need to overthrow that democratic system and establish something else. Now, when do people become more willing to kind of accept the rhetoric of populists, okay, such as Donald Trump or Marie Le Pen or Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey? Well, it's usually during times of crises, during times of economic crises or political crises, when there is conflict in society or an economic problem that leads people to become more likely to want to overthrow their current sitting government. Populist rhetoric can destabilize democracies. It can make it so that people become less willing to support the political system. And when this happens, This makes it more likely, for example, for military leaders to overthrow the government, right? Because there is mass discontent in society and there's a lack of stability. It can also, as well, make it more likely for an auto golpe to happen where a president or a prime minister centralizes power because there's a mass base of support for deconstructing the democratic system. And by the way, the number of countries that have been moving in an authoritarian direction have been growing in the past 15 years. So, whereas from the 1980s to the 2000s, we saw this third wave of democratization as democracy was spreading throughout the globe, the last 15 years have painted a very different picture. The number of democracies is declining. America's democracy score has been declining in the last 15 years, and especially in the last year. So, the past couple of months under Donald Trump have been a rough period for America's democracy. We've also seen this trend in other countries throughout the globe. So we see this in terms of the statistics. Freedom House, varieties of democracy, and all sorts of other statistics that measure democracy across the globe, like Polity 4, they all show democracy on the decline. Okay. Now, why is this the case? Why is it that we're seeing this trend across the globe? Well, part of it has to do with globalization and growing economic inequality. Well, there's a lot of good things about globalization. There's a lot of good things about free trade, right? It leads to more peace between countries. It's led to more economic growth. At the same time, it's made it easier for the wealthy to grow more wealthy. Rich companies have been able to shift their factories overseas to where they could pay workers lower wages. They have also, as well, been able to hide a lot of their money in offshore tax havens. And as the wealthy have grown wealthier, the wealth of the bottom 90% of the population across the world has stagnated. And with growing economic inequality, this has created growing frustration across the globe. We have seen an increase in the number of civil wars as well as ethnic conflict. A lot of ethnic minorities have not benefited as much from globalization as powerful ethnic majorities have. On top of this, as well, we have seen the growth in the number of crises in terms of housing and market crashes since 2008. So the first big housing crisis during this era of democratic backsliding took place in the United States and caused an economic recession to spread across the globe. This is known as the 2008 housing crash. On top of that, as well, we had the COVID crisis in 2020 that led to an economic downturn across the world. Here's the thing, when things suddenly get worse for people, they will often blame their sitting governments for these problems. Now, they might blame their dictatorships. This happened with the Arab Spring protests, but they also might blame their sitting democracies as well. So we're going to see this is the case with Tunisia and Egypt. Now, to make matters worse, during this era, we see the emergence of a new technology, social media. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, later TikTok, have changed the way we have interacted with information. Prior to this, most people got information from professional media outlets and books. Today, that is not the case. Instead, people go online, and there are a couple of big problems with online discourse. While it did initially make it easier for marginalized groups to protest and get out there and express themselves, eventually, autocrats and dictators figured out how to manipulate this technology. And on top of that, wealthy billionaires have figured out how to get more clicks and to get people to go on these websites more, but they've done it in a very negative way. They've created these algorithms that have made it so that people, okay, will click more on articles, okay, and then they will be exposed to articles that are farther to the left or right of their political opinion that will then get them to click even more. In other words, algorithms have been set up so as to radicalize people online, right? So if I read an article that's anti-Trump, I'm going to get another article that's even more anti-Trump. Or if I'm going to get an article that's pro-Trump, I'm going to get an article that's even more pro-Trump. If I get an article that is pro-left wing, I'll get an article that's even more pro-left wing that'll show up in my social media feed. What this does is it radicalizes people, and at a time when people are really angry already because of these crises that are taking place, it makes people, even more angry as a consequence. So it makes it harder to have compromise and debate within society. And when you get this situation, it makes people embrace more anti-establishment attitudes. So as a consequence, we have seen within the world's democracies, okay, support for these systems decline, according to polling data. And on top of that, within the Arab world, we see a reverse of the polling trends before the Arab Spring. Since 2011, support for democracy has gradually declined in places like Tunisia. And on top of that, we've seen a resurgence of some major dictatorships like Russia and China during this time period, whose political power has begun to grow. So we've seen Russia invade Ukraine recently. China's economic and political power has grown. These countries do not support democracy. So here are the countries since 2005 whose democracy scores have declined greatly. Okay, so here you can see the United States is on the list, right? So the data is there to back this up. Egypt, Turkey, Tunisia, Brazil, Poland, all of these countries have experienced democratic backsliding across the globe. India, the world's largest democracy, has witnessed democratic backsliding. So this is a major problem that the world has witnessed. And it is also taking place in some parts of the Arab world as well, so very relevant for a class on Middle East politics. So the Arab Spring turned into an Arab winter, an Arab nightmare, okay? First off, most countries didn't have a democratic transition to begin with. Most countries either only had small protests, and in the case of Bahrain, which did have very big protests, its regime was never overthrown to begin with. The monarchy survived because of Saudi Arabia's invasion. Go watch a prior lecture to understand what happened there. There were also three long civil wars that took place in the aftermath of these protests across the region in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. These countries never had democratic transitions, and on top of that, they had very violent civil wars. It also created migration crises that spread into neighboring countries, and it also as well destabilized the economies of their neighbors. And on top of that, Egypt, while its dictator Hosni Mubarak did get overthrown, it only had one election in the aftermath, and the democracy did not survive very long. By 2013, there was a military coup. We can't even say this country had an official democratic transition because a democratic transition involves two consecutive competitive elections. This never happened in Egypt. So by 2013, the military stepped into power. Tunisia, the only country that had a democratic transition after 10 years, the democracy eventually collapsed in 2021. There was an autogolpe led by then President Kais Saied. So what caused a lot of these problems? Well, we're going to learn more about the civil wars next class. So we'll learn why those civil wars broke out. But there were also migration crises and economic crises that spread throughout the region that turned people against these revolutions. Neighboring Tunisia and Egypt is the country Libya. They had a civil war after Gaddafi was overthrown. The country, in fact, is still really they are really suffering from a conflict that has split the country in half. So because of these crises, it led to growing support for populism and counter-revolution. Counter-revolution is when people start to protest and go against the ideals of the revolution. And counter-revolutions, they are very common with revolutions. Why? Because the initial protest will sometimes lead to civil wars, conflict, and economic decline, which leads to people turning against the ideals of the revolutionaries. This happened in France, for example, with the Great Terror. 1789, France had a revolution. By 1799, Napoleon stepped into power. There was a military coup in that country. In fact, France had three failed revolutions: 1789, 1830, and 1848, before they finally became a democracy in 1870. So the French, they liked their revolutions, but most of them actually failed. It's not until 1870 that they became a democracy. So we're going to now go into detail on Egypt's revolution. Now, we talked more about this case study in prior lectures. If you want to learn more about why this revolution took place, go see that prior lecture on the economic causes of the Arab Spring, as well as the ideological causes and the spread of democracy. I talked a lot about this case study. Okay, I also have this video here. There's a lot of documentaries online that have been produced on this. I highly recommend going and watching those. This could give you a more, an emotional understanding of why these revolutions took place. Well, just to put a long story short, in 2011, starting on January 25th, a group of protesters occupied Tahrir Square. Some of these protesters were liberals in support of capitalist democracy. Some were social democrats in support of welfare redistribution and labor rights. Others were Islamist, Muslim Democrats in support of a mix of democracy as well as conservative religious principles, right? So the mixing of church and states, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. So January 25th, these protesters started to gather in Tahrir Square. They were initially met with a lot of police brutality, but they overcame the police, and the police eventually they had to back down because of the sheer size of the protests. These protesters wanted a number of things. They wanted longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak and his National Democratic Party to step down from power. They wanted justice for the victims of police brutality in the country. They wanted economic justice, redistributing wealth to the poor, an increase in welfare state expenditure. They also wanted, as well, increase in freedom, civil rights, and political liberties, the right to vote, the right to protest. And so, thus, there was a lot of pressure on Hosni Mubarak to step down. Now, Mubarak himself, he ruled through a number of mechanisms. He had a ruling party he ruled through, but he was also part of a military regime. Many of the economic and political elites came from the military. Hosni Mubarak himself was a military man. So a lot of these protesters as well wanted the military out of politics. And one of the symbols of this revolution was a young man named Khalid Said. Khalid Said was a young man from Alexandria who was arrested in 2011, and he was never given a trial. In fact, he was brought to a local police station and he was beaten to death. And his face was so mangled that his mother had trouble recognizing it. Well, many people who heard about this, they decided to start a Facebook page in memorial of what happened to him and as a protest. And they created this movement called Kulina Khalid Said. Okay, so there's a lot of mass anger. So one of the reasons why this revolution was able to take place was because of the emergence of social media and the fact that a lot of protest movements were able to use this to start the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2025. Now, once that revolution started, okay, it quickly grew in size. A lot of the protesters were inspired by neighboring Tunisia, whose revolution was successful in overthrowing Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali. And of course, in Tunisia, in the following months, there's going to be a democratic transition eventually. So a lot of Egyptian protesters, they saw what happened in Tunisia and they thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And so thus, protest in Tahrir Square, the center of Cairo, grow. Tahrir in Arabic means liberation square. So they meet at the center of the city and they demand the downfall of the regime. And 3 days later, the protests were initially started by liberal activists and social democratic activists like the 6th of April movement, but they were eventually joined by the Muslim Brotherhood 3 days later. And on January 28th, there was this day of rage where some buildings were burnt down. There was a lot of violence with the police, and the National Democratic Party headquarters themselves were burnt down in the process. So eventually, the protest grew in size. And a few days later, eventually, there was a mass labor strike amongst the different public sector workers. So across the whole country, we see protests spread. And the Muslim Brotherhood was a particularly important actor in this movement because they had a lot of resources, a lot of funding. They were able to help really organize this protest, along with various labor union activists and liberal protesters. And in fact, an important part of this story here, the Brotherhood played a more important role in starting these protests than the Islamist party Ennahda did in Tunisia. Ennahda at the time was in exile in Tunisia, and they were, in fact, most of their activists were in Europe. Ennahda also, as well, was much more moderate, and they were much more willing to compromise with liberals than the Muslim Brotherhood were. An important point to bring up here. Now, eventually, the protests succeeded. On February 11th, the military forced Mubarak to step down. Now, this is very different from Tunisia. In Tunisia, the military did not get involved at all. The military in Tunisia was very small and very professional. During the previous authoritarian regime, they didn't get involved in politics. It was a civilian dictatorship in Tunisia. But in Egypt, in contrast, since 1952, the military had a long history of getting involved in politics. In fact, that authoritarian regime was founded in a coup in 52. Okay, and even though they transitioned to a civilian regime in 1954, the future presidents of that regime, all the way up until 2011, were all former members of the military, and the military played a strong role in Egypt in politics and economics. There's a very large amount of spending on the military in this country. So the military is powerful, and they decided to force Mubarak to step down. Now, why did they decide to do this? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, the protests were so massive that they were worried that the military would lose its legitimacy with the public. Number two, the protests were so large and consisted of so many elements of society that the generals were afraid that if they told soldiers to send tanks into the streets and crush the protests, that the soldiers would mutiny, they would rebel, and the military would fracture. This could lead to a collapse of the military or perhaps a civil war in the country. The military wanted to avoid this. The protests were so large because there were so many that were angry at the regime for a variety of reasons. So they wanted to try to calm down the public. They forced Mubarak to step down. So Egypt, because of its larger and more politicized military, they played a greater role in this transition. And as you're going to find out, it's a big reason why this transition failed. So the military, fearing this civil war, they decide to not crack down on the protests. They decide to force Mubarak to step down. And I lived through this, man. I mean, the living through the revolution was a very emotional thing. A lot of these protesters, initially they didn't think it would lead to the collapse of Mubarak's regime, but as the protests grew, it really took everybody by surprise, including the military. And so thus, after 18 days, the military decided to step in and pressure Mubarak to step down. And suddenly, all these tanks are on the streets. Now, here's the thing. Unlike Tunisia, we don't end up with an immediate democratic transition where the opposition forms a transitional council and holds elections. Instead, we end up with a military coup and a junta. See, the military stepped into power. So they were hoping by getting rid of Mubarak that the protest would stop, and maybe just by replacing Mubarak with some other military man as president, the people would be fine with that. So they create a junta called the Security Council of the Armed Forces, led by General Tantawi. So he was the head of the armed forces at the time. But here's the thing. The protesters weren't happy with that. They had been so really radicalized by the revolution. They wanted more than a change in Mubarak's leadership. They wanted democratization. They wanted a shift from a dictatorship to a new political system. So those protests in the following year became directed towards the military. And initially, the Islamists and secularists were united. In that square in Tahrir, the Brotherhood and the liberals, they fought together to try to get a transition to a new regime. And eventually, the military decided to back down and announce new elections. Now, as you're going to find out, they are not going to really lead the way towards a democratic transition. They're never truly going to give up power. This is just a delay tactic. They're going to announce new elections in 2000 and for the end of 2011 and the beginning of, I'm sorry, for the end of 2011 and the beginning of 2012. And so they agree They sit down and engage in pact making. Okay, they agree with the liberals and Islamists. They sit down with them in the military, and they say, "Look, we're going to have a transition to civilian rule." There were some, international actors like the UN, the EU, the United States that were also pressuring the different sides to compromise here, and so thus the agreement was we're going to hold elections at the end of 2011, starting that for parliament, and those elections would be completed at the beginning of 2012, and then for the presidency a little later. And after that took place, by the end of 2012, a new constitution could be written, and we would have a transition to democracy. That was what was agreed upon. Okay. And this is a great symbol, by the way, of this transitional process. In Tahrir Square, I'll never forget this. You had Christians and Muslims, Islamists and liberals, and social democrats protesting together for change. Okay, so we see here a Coptic priest, a Christian priest, next to a Muslim imam, just kind of supporting each other. In fact, I was there during those 2 years of the revolution, and during those protests, anytime it was prayer time and Muslims had to pray, okay, the Christians would often form a very large ring around the protesters to protect them from security forces. So it was this really beautiful moment of unity here between these different activists. Now, when did things fall apart? Well, they fell apart with the elections. You're going to find out the electoral outcomes were very different here than in Tunisia. The parliamentary elections were held from late 2011 to 2012. There's 2 rounds of elections because it's something called a majoritarian system. If you don't win a majority of the seats in a district, you have to then run in a second round as a candidate. And the top 2 will run in the second round, and then whoever wins the most gets the seats. So they have 2 rounds of elections, and dozens of parties participated. Now, some of these parties were the old parties. So the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, ran. The WAF party, a liberal party, ran elections. But there were also tons of new opposition parties here, various new capitalist and social democrat, as well as far-right Islamist parties, Salafist parties, they begin to run. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is the more moderate of the Islamist spectrum within Egypt, in that they're Muslim Democrats. While they believe in the mixing of religion and state, they want Sharia law, they also believe in democracy and holding elections. So they're kind of like the Republican Party in the United States. They're kind of like the Islamic Justice and Development Party in Turkey. Now, of course, there's some diversity amongst the movement, right? Some of the movement actors are more moderate than others. And at various points in time, members of the Brotherhood have either moved towards the left or towards the right, depending on the circumstances. And in other countries, some Muslim Brotherhood members have been radicalized, as is the case with the creation of Hamas in Palestine in 1987. But the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they wanted elections. And they dominated those elections. They by far were the largest party. And the party that came in second was a far-right Salafist party, a fundamentalist party that was actually an anti-democracy party called Hezbollah Nur. They came in second. And this is a party that kind of supports the very conservative ideals of Muslims in places like Saudi Arabia. And in contrast, the liberals performed very poorly in these elections. The new WAF party came in a distant third. In fact, the liberals were very disillusioned with this. In contrast, in Tunisia, the Ennahda, when they returned from exile and ran in elections, they only won a plurality of the vote, not a majority. They had to form a coalition with liberal parties to form a government. This was not the case in Egypt. The Islamists are going to win the vast majority of the votes. And the same thing is going to happen with presidential elections, which were held in May of 2012. Free and fair elections were held for Egypt's presidential elections, first time in Egyptian history. And as a result, okay, we are going to have the Muslim Brotherhood win these elections. It's going to be the first time since 1952 a non-military member is going to take the position of the presidency. And so Mohammed Morsi of the Brotherhood, he wins these elections. And to make things more depressing for the liberals, the guy who came in second was a former Mubarak era crony named Ahmed Shafiq. So I'll never forget, living through this. A lot of my liberal friends and colleagues very depressed by these outcomes. So things did not go as planned. And the left wing activists, so because they were so disillusioned by this, many of them are going to slowly turn against the democratization process, realizing that they might not be able to compete. Egypt is a lot poorer than Tunisia. It's a lot more conservative in terms of its values. Far less people support liberal democracy. Now, this doesn't mean the majority of people in Egypt didn't support democracy. According to polling, they do. A little less than 80% do, but they tend to support a democracy that's in favor of mixing religion and state. There's less parity amongst the different actors, and it's tough to have pact making and democratic transitions when you don't have ideological diversity amongst your political parties. And so, thus, here we can see on this with the vote in most districts, most parts of Egypt, the Islamists dominated, okay, especially in the countryside, okay, where you have a lot more conservative individuals. So pact making fails here, okay. Now, what happened in the following year that's going to lead to the military coming back to power? Okay, well, number one, this young, early democratic transition is going to be hit with numerous problems. The revolution is going to lead to economic instability all across the region. Okay, so not only is Egypt's economy going to decline, Tunisia's economy is going to decline, but we're going to see mass migration from Libya destabilize this young democratic transition. And we're going to see growing unemployment and just inflation in the country. The cost of goods is going to skyrocket. And I lived through this. My salary went down. I was running a social studies department in Egypt during this. And just my ability to be able to pay off my student loans and to be able to feed myself really just went down during this time period, as it did for so many other people living in Egypt. And I was lucky. I was a Westerner earning, close to a Western salary at a private Egyptian school. But for those Egyptians, working, in the informal sector where they had very low paying jobs, their tough lives got even tougher. Now, on top of that as well, you had all sorts of problems in Egypt with migration crises. So a lot of Egyptians that were working as guest workers in Libya were forced to return to Egypt. And so thus the unemployment rate just skyrockets across the country. Now, on top of that, there were actors that were actively working to do everything they could to destabilize Egyptian politics, particularly the military and the police. As I said, the military were never in favor of a democratic transition. They were just delaying their return to power. So one of the things the police started to do is they stopped to enforce laws. They stopped enforcing a lot of criminal laws, and they also as well stopped enforcing traffic laws. It became a lot harder to get to work. It became, more noticeable, the uptick in crime within society. And they did this on purpose to destabilize the transition. Now, on top of this, the judges in Egypt were never changed from the Mubarak era during this transition. You had the same judges, and thus they were making all sorts of rulings in the courts that were creating problems for the democratic transition. In fact, they very quickly, after the parliamentary elections, disbanded parliament for very flimsy legal reasons and said new elections would have to be held a year later. So thus, as a consequence of this, there was no parliament to oversee the process of writing a new constitution. And unfortunately, because many Egyptians are a lot of them are poor. They live in the countryside. They're not as savvy about what was happening here. Many of them just kind of accepted what was happening to the dismay of a lot of well-educated liberals and Islamists in society that realized how big of a problem with this was. Now, as a consequence of this, President Morsi was the only elected official left to write the Constitution. So he dominated the Constitution process here in terms of how it would be written. And the liberals were kind of shut out of the process as a consequence. And so what we see happened by the end of 2012 is liberal and labor activists turn against Morsi's government. The new constitution that got churned out was something that favored the Muslim Brotherhood's rhetoric, right? So, it's something that's, was very much a right-wing constitution. So while it promoted free and fair elections, it was also conservative on religious values. So as a consequence, we begin to see people turn against this regime. You already had a lot of supporters of the former Mubarak regime and the military. They had already existed after the revolution. They are going to be joined by a lot of liberals who are going to take to the streets to demand the overthrow of this regime. Now, the liberals, they wanted a new transition process, one that would benefit them. But of course, supporters of the military, they wanted to go back to the old regime. So you get these mass protests, a counter-revolution in June of 2013. And this is when the military decides to strike. This time around, they are not going to be so kind to the opposition. General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the new general at this time, he steps into power in June 2003. He comes into power and he overthrows the Muslim Brotherhood's government. He puts Morsi in prison, and he also puts a lot of Muslim Brotherhood activists in prison. And he kills a lot of their members in the process while he's cracking down on their protests. Now, the coup justification, so this time around, he was able to justify in the coup on the basis that Egypt's economy was collapsing, that civil wars were happening in neighboring states, that the government needed to suppress the emergence of radical Islamism. So he was pointing to what was happening in ISIS in Syria and the emergence of radical right-wing groups in Egypt during this process. He also, as well, was able to kind of play divide and conquer here because the liberals and Islamists were no longer united with each other. They were no longer together in the square. Instead, they were separate and were actually protesting against each other. It made it easier for the military to divide and conquer. The liberals this time around supported a coup, and they supported the regime coming back into power. And in the process, the Islamists were suppressed with violence. In August of 2013, a mass protest was held by the Islamists in Rabaa Square in Cairo, and the military sent in their forces, and it was suppressed with harsh violence. In fact, I had a colleague that got shot in the head during this process. So it was just, a very sad and terrible thing to say. Now, here's the thing. Those liberals who were supporting all of this, many of them were, eventually, they too were turned on. Once they dealt with the Brotherhood, the military then turned on the liberals, right? First, they came for that group, and then suddenly they're coming for the next one. The liberals, the bloggers, they were thrown in prison and they were suppressed with violence. And thus we get a return in the aftermath of this to authoritarianism. Now, eventually, Sisi, he's going to take off his uniform. He's going to run for president in 2014, but there are going to be fixed elections. The elections are going to be fraudulent. They're not going to be competitive. He's going to win with 99% of the vote, and a new constitution, an authoritarian one, is going to be created. So this is the Rabaa Square massacre. Over 1,000 people were killed. Here's Mohammed Morsi. He's the person that was overthrown with this coup. And, thus we see the revolution die here. And here's the thing. In the aftermath of this, the regime is going to learn a lot from their failures from 2011. See, authoritarian regimes can learn from past failures, from past revolutions, as well as democratic transitions elsewhere, to try to adapt to the times to survive. And Sisi, as well as other autocrats across the Middle East, adapted. And so what are some of the adaptations that were made in response to the Arab Spring? Well, number one, policing social media. We have seen throughout the Arab world, as well as elsewhere in places like China, dictators have learned to monitor and censor online activity. When social media first started, they didn't really know how to deal with it. And they were kind of surprised about how important Facebook and other media outlets became online. So what started to happen in the following years after the Arab Spring is they got better at censoring and monitoring. They created whole new institutions to monitor online activity. They begin to arrest bloggers. So Sisi's regime puts a lot of those liberal bloggers that led the revolution in prison. And on top of that, they also begin as well to pay online trolls to go online and spread pro-authoritarian propaganda. We see this not only in Russia and China today, but in places like Turkey, Egypt, and Tunisia. So, this represents here authoritarian learning. Now, on top of that, they also begin to redesign urban centers throughout their countries to make it harder to protest. This, interestingly enough, after the French Revolution of 1848, Paris was redesigned by Napoleon III to make it easier for security forces to crack down on protest by building much larger squares and much larger streets. Well, the same thing's going to happen in Egypt here. More um, more uh, more pro-regime cities are going to be designed here. Urban squares in Cairo are going to be really reimagined to make it harder for people to protest and to make it harder for those protesters to threaten the regime. So if you go to Tahrir Square today, for example, there are plainclothes um, uh, there are plainclothes officers that monitor activity in the squares, and there are as well a lot of barriers within the square itself that make it harder for people to congregate. On top of that, as well, a new capital is being built on the outskirts of Cairo by Sisi to insulate the government institutions from the masses. So they created this new city on the outskirts in the desert, far away from the capital, as a way to try to protect the regime from the populace. Now, on top of that, as well, one of the ways that autocrats have learned from the Arab Spring is that you can't just allow revolutions to happen elsewhere. If you see a revolution happening elsewhere, you have to support that country's dictatorship to prevent it from falling. Otherwise, you can be next. We call these revolutionary cascades. And so, thus, the dictatorships of the Middle East have learned this the hard way. The Arab Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they began to send a lot of aid to countries like Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, and Egypt to try to prop up their dictatorships. They're also doing this in Tunisia currently. So if you prevent democracies from spreading in other countries, you insulate and protect your regime. Now, finally, they've also used as well this instability throughout the world and within the Middle East specifically to promote a counter-revolutionary discourse to justify all this behavior, particularly to the West and the United States specifically, making the argument that, hey, if we get instability in the region, oil prices are going to rise, it's going to make the world less safe, and more migrants are going to travel to Europe. So thus, we've seen this counter-revolutionary discourse. And so this is meant to these arguments are meant to prevent civil wars, terrorism, and radical Islamism, but it's used then as an excuse to crack down on the opposition. And so, thus, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi turned from a military dictator to a electoral authoritarian president, one who is elected with 99% of the vote in 2014, and he still dominates the country today with an iron fist. The country still has massive socioeconomic and political problems. None of the problems of the Arab Spring were solved. In fact, the situation has gotten worse. But because the regime has tightened the mechanisms for controlling its people, it has enabled it to survive thus far. And the same thing happened in Tunisia, but it happened a little later. Now, in Tunisia, just like Egypt, they experienced a crisis. Now, last class, we talked about how the political actors overcame that crisis to lead to a democratic transition by 2014. However, the problems economically would continue in the following 5 years in Tunisia. The economy would grow worse. Migration from Libya and sub-Saharan Africa would grow worse. On top of that, there would be an Islamist insurgency on their border with Algeria that would become problematic. All these problems would build in this new young democracy. And despite some of the positive reforms after 2014, the fact was that the new parliament had so many problems dealing with the economic crisis. And to make matters worse, the 2014 transition with the new constitution, it was made possible because secularists and Islamists compromised to make that new constitution a reality. But in that first government they created in 2014, it consisted of a large parliamentary coalition that consisted of Islamists like Ennahda, as well as secularists such as Nader Tunis. And because they created such a large coalition of diverse actors, they struggled to make reforms. Nader Tunis, representing the old regime elites, they didn't want to make many changes to the regime, and Ennahda, feeling pressure to compromise with Nader Tunis, they ended up not really supporting significant reforms to redistribute wealth and to deal with these socioeconomic problems. So there was stagnation in parliament, not much change in these 5 years. There wasn't transitional justice. Former members of the authoritarian regime didn't really, get see trials and get arrested for their crimes. As a consequence, there was a turn, really a counter-revolution in Tunisia. Many people began to turn against the regime. Support for democracy declined. In fact, I did research in Tunisia. I did polling during this time period, and some of my research has been published based on this. So, as a consequence, support for democracies and these established parties declined in Tunisia. And in the process, populist gained seat in parliament. Sisi, by the way, was a populist, and so was a lot of the new parties that emerged in parliament during this time period. A party called the Dictator Party is going to emerge, for example, that is going to promote a return to authoritarianism. That was the name of the party under the country's former dictator, Habib Bourguiba, from 1956 to 1987. A lot of other supporters of the Ben Ali regime from 87 to 2010, they're going to come out of the woodwork during this time period. They're going to promote a return to authoritarianism. And eventually, in that same year, a new president called Kais Saied was elected to parliament. He's a populist, much like Donald Trump, much like Marine Le Pen in France, and much like people like Vladimir Putin in Russia. So as a consequence, he gets elected, and things grew even worse in 2020. The COVID crisis broke out, and there was really paralysis in parliaments. There was infighting. The populists were known for their loud rhetoric. They would start fights in parliament. And what happened? The whole system broke down and people really grew frustrated. So eventually, by August of 2021, and I was there for that, just like I was there in Egypt in 2013, Kais Saied suspended parliament, and he eventually shut down parliament. He disbanded the constitution. He created a new constitution, and he created an electoral authoritarian regime. In fact, members of Ennahda, including Rashid Ghannouchi, were arrested. In the process of all of this, during 2014 to 2021, the liberal parties also collapsed. It just was an absolute disaster. And by 2021, the democracy is no more, and thus Kais Saied becomes the new dictator of this country. And of course, we talked about in an earlier lecture how Turkey also had backsliding during this era. They were also experiencing a crisis after the Arab Spring, and Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party centralized control there as well. So as a consequence, all these attempted democratic transitions across the region failed. And as someone who's lived, by the way, in two of these situations, I lived through Egypt, I lived through Tunisia. I can tell you right now, I'm seeing some of the same signs in the United States with democratic backsliding. A lot of these same problems are emerging here. So in order to push back against this, civil society is going to need to stand up. In Tunisia, civil society was not strong enough to withstand what Kais Saied was doing because too many people supported the backsliding. So that's it for my lecture today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them below. Take it easy, guys.